seen the overdose deaths in Virginia increase. This gives you an example of all overdose deaths. And I want to point out that this year we're scheduled to be well over 1,000, maybe even to 1,100, if the numbers pan out like we expect. And it is different in different parts of the state. The face of the opiate addiction for Senator Carrico doesn't necessarily look like the addiction in the D.C. area for Senator Howell. It's different. You will hear them down there say things, we don't have heroin, we have a Suboxone problem. People break and enter to get Suboxone. It colors the approach to drug courts and other things that the rest of you don't necessarily see in your jurisdictions, and we're going to need to discuss that a little bit. These are prescription opioid overdoses, those Southwest. Then look at this, heroin and fentanyl overdoses. A little different pattern to that, and it's something that we have to recognize as we go forward. Wanted to make a point here about addiction as we get started. Got these numbers from Dr. Barber this morning. We had over 600,000 Virginians, so 7% illicit drug use in the past month. Of those who are addicted, 75% have taken a prescribed medicine before they've taken the heroin. In our CSB population, in 2010, 35% of individuals presenting for substance use disorders. Now it's 41% of the people have substance use disorder, i.e. they are addicted, and 6.5% have abused or addicted to alcohol. Now, the issue here is addiction. The common theme with all of these drugs, whether it's nicotine, alcohol, Percocet, OxyContin, fentanyl, heroin, methamphetamines, cocaine, when you are addicted, it's something that's just changed. Whatever got you started, now you are addicted. Your brain has been hijacked, as it were. And we wanted to explain that a little bit. We have a specialist. We're bringing a doctor in. Dr. Mishka Turplin is an infectious or addictive medicine specialist at VCU. He's board certified in obstetrics and gynecology. He's just been at VCU for about 3 weeks, and he came from Baltimore, which unfortunately is probably the East Coast capital for the heroin crisis. And I'd like for Dr. Turplin to spend a few minutes with you, walking you through the very high level what the disease is and why this is a chronic disease once an individual is addicted and why they just can't quit. Dr. Turplin?
Good morning, thank you. Thanks for having me. I want to begin just by looking at, not everyone who uses a substance becomes addicted to it. It depends by substance. The most addictive substance, so to speak, is nicotine. About 1/3 of people who've used nicotine in the past year will meet criteria for a use disorder. Opioids are second. Somewhere between 20 and 30% of people who used an opioid in the prior year develop an addiction. So not everyone. So the question is, why do some people become addicted and others don't? And it's a complex interplay between an individual's biology, their genes, their social environment, their home environment, the larger social environment, and their brain. In particular, we know a few things about what predisposes somebody to develop an addiction. The earlier you're exposed to a substance, the more likely you are to develop an addiction to it. Individuals with co-occurring other behavioral health conditions, mental health disorders, trauma, etc., are more likely to develop an addiction as well. In fact, when we think about adverse childhood experiences, childhood sexual or physical abuse, approximately 50 or so more percent of individuals with addiction will have those events. And amongst individuals with PTSD, returning veterans, other people, at least 50% of them have a lifetime likelihood of developing an addiction. And so for many people, when they first use a substance, they have these pre-existing vulnerabilities. And that can lead to a cascade of events of addiction. So we think about addiction as a disease that's centered in the brain, but that the symptoms are behaviors. Symptoms such as cravings, symptoms such as compulsive use, symptoms such as continued to use in spite of knowledge of the harms, continue to use in spite of all the negative consequences that develop around you. And what I'll show you next, these compulsive use leads to changes in the brain structure and in its function. Drugs enter the brain in what's called the reward center. It's at the center of that yellow, where all the yellow arrows come out of. And that's a very old part of the brain that regulates appetite, sex, etc. And all drugs to which people develop addictions enter there and lead to a cascade of neurotransmitters, one of which is dopamine. And those dopamine neurons project into the cortex. And that's the higher part of the brain, where executive functioning, behavior, memory, things like that. So you can see from an old part of the brain leads to disturbances of the higher levels of cognition. When we contrast brain images between individuals with an addiction and those without, you can see one column are people with addiction, the other those without, and the rows are by substance. And the red, the more bright colored areas are parts of the brain which light up, where there's more activity of dopamine. And you can see people with addiction have a decrease in activity, a downregulation, of the receptors. So actually there's less of the dopamine activity happening in an addicted brain. So the disease changes the brain. And that's part of when we say addiction's a disease, it's because it's preventable, it's treatable, but because it changes biology. Just like other diseases, diabetes changes the biology of an individual with diabetes. And these are images sort of contrasting healthy diseased brains and healthy diseased hearts. And you can see parallels in the imaging. So what happens if we don't treat addiction? This is the dominant media image of what addiction is. It's actually in its untreated state. Addiction's been described as a career of narrowing options, and you see that. People, like, their social relations fall apart, their parenting ability, they don't function in the workforce, they end up incarcerated, homeless. There's also individual level medical sequelae of untreated addiction. Bacterial endocarditis. You have diabetes and you have an addiction, you don't get treated for the diabetes or screened, so you end up in the hospital and the care costs more and is more complicated. And there's social/medical consequences. Acquisition and transmission of HIV and Hep C. And as you saw from the slides before, one of the other sequelae of untreated addiction is overdose and overdose death. So what's treatment? Addiction is a brain-centered disease. The symptoms are behaviors. So you have to treat both. You have to treat the brain and you have to treat the behaviors. So the biological basis of treatment is medication. For opioid use disorder, this would be methadone, buprenorphine, or naltrexone. But also, essential is the treating the behavioral component of addiction, and that's through counseling, etc. So what about relapse? Relapse is part of the disease process of addiction. It can occur at any time, during treatment, after treatment, and it means that the treatment, the intervention I'm giving somebody who relapses, that means that intervention's not working for them and I have to change my course. And it turns out that relapse for addiction looks very similar to relapse for diabetes, hypertension, or asthma. In fact, this slide comes from a study from about 20-some years ago now. And this is part of when we say addiction's a chronic disease, it's because it behaves like other chronic diseases. People relapse with addiction just like they do with hypertension, diabetes, or asthma. One of the other benefits of treatment is reduction in overdose death. The slide on the left is from Baltimore City. The red line is overdose death. And the bottom dotted line is buprenorphine. And obviously, before it was what didn't exist on the market. When it came on the market, we had a big uptake in prescribing and capacity within the system. And as more people got buprenorphine, overdose deaths decreased. And on the right-hand side is the relationship between overdose death and methadone. The blue line are people